Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, talking about some great punk albums from the 2020s. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So yes, punk music was formed in the 1970s, and over the last 50 years, it has greatly evolved. And really, you can look back at every decade since then, and every decade has its own style of punk music. But in the 2020s, punk music might look different and sound different than it did in the 70s and the 90s, but it's still out there. There's some great albums coming out every single year. I've got a few I'm going to go over. None of these are really in any kind of order. I do have like a top 10, but most of them are really kind of interchangeable, except for my top 2 or 3 albums. And I've got a few honorable mentions also to go over. And with my honorable mentions, I tried to include some lesser known bands in there that a lot of people out there might not have known about or not listened to these albums, but I highly recommend checking them out. They are really good. They just didn't make my top 10. First album from my lesser known bands honorable mentions list came out in 2023, and that is Cheap Grills by Sincere Engineer. This is a band I knew nothing about when this album came out. So, like I said, this came out in 2023. It probably wasn't until early part of 2024 that I saw it in my record store, decided to grab a copy of it. I'd heard some people talking about it in the Vinyl Den Facebook group, and I've seen it online a couple times. I'd never listened to it before, never streamed it. I saw it in my record store, decided to grab a copy of it, and I was instantly hooked. It is very catchy, it's very melodic. It's got these sharp and witty and relatable lyrics on this album, and it's one I go back to pretty regularly. Another one of those honorable mention albums, and this is a band that unfortunately I just went on an indefinite hiatus. Their album came out in 2024, and that's Gangster Love by Super American. This is one of those punk albums that has more of a nostalgic kind of sound to it. It's infused with a lot of humor in there. You can tell this band definitely doesn't take themselves seriously. For an album like that, it's got a lot more emotional depth to these songs than I thought it would. Like I said, it's really unfortunate this band went on a hiatus. Another album that came out in 2023 that I knew nothing about until this one came out, I think, like November, December 2023, and it was like early part of 2024 when someone recommended it to me. But that's Together and Lonesome by Youth Fountain. And what I think makes this album so good is it's on the more melodic side of punk. It's got some emo mixed into it. And it's another one of those albums that just kind of flew under the radar for me. It wasn't until someone in the Vinyl Den Facebook group recommended it to me that I sat down and listened to it. And I think I made it like maybe a quarter way through the album before I hopped online and bought a copy of it. And there's some recurring themes on this album of the mental health struggles that a lot of people went through during the pandemic. I think a lot of that came through on this album. And if you're a fan of that more like wild and fun, almost kind of absurd style of punk music, so Stankfinger came out with an album last year called Three Finger Discount. This is a British punk band. And as you can see from the title of the band and from the album, they don't take themselves seriously. There's a lot of humor injected in this album also. This is one of those examples where it shows that punk music doesn't have to always be serious to get its message across. So if you're a fan of that like more tongue-in-cheek kind of style of punk music that NoFX had in the early part of the 90s, this is an album that's really kind of up that alley. And if you like that more polished sound from punk music, Neck Deep released their self-titled album in 2024. This is another one that's not in my top 10, but it's pretty close to it. It still deals with a lot of those same themes a lot of other punk albums have. But like I said, it's a little more slick, it's a little more refined than some of the other stuff that's come out over the last several years. And the last one I got on my honorable mentions list is one that we've got to talk about. I know a lot of people out there hate this artist and hate this album, but it's the album that brought punk music back into the mainstream in the 2020s, and that's Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly. This came out in 2020, and honestly, the album reignited interest in punk music in the mainstream. And while a lot of people look at this album as this more nostalgic album that, Machine Gun Kelly was just trying to take advantage of the popularity of the genre, there's a lot of people out there, a lot of younger people, that discovered other bands in punk music because of this album. This album was very much a gateway album for people I work with that would have never listened to punk music before did because of this album. Is this the best punk album? No, but there's some good stuff on here. If this album had been made by anyone else, I think it'd be more popular than it is. Then on to my top 10, and like I said before, these aren't really in any kind of order. I think the top 2 or 3 albums I think are the best of the 2020s, but the album I got at 10 could have been I could have put it at number 5, and 5 I could have put at number 8. It's really kind of interchangeable after that. But these are the albums that, in my opinion, I think are the 10 best albums in the 2020s. So the first one I got, I'll put at number 10, is One More Time by Blink-182. This is the big reunion album for Blink-182. Tom Long was back in the band, and it was a massive success. At number 1 on the Billboard 200, sold a ton of copies. But what I really find interesting about this album, I think what makes this album so good, is it's not really an album for the fans. This was more an album for them. This is a band healing from all the issues that they had in the past. They came together and made what I think is one of the better albums from their career. Yes, the album does have some production issues on there. And hopefully when they do their next album, they'll have a different producer than Travis Barker. Even though I thought Travis did an okay job, there's just some issues on here that I think probably should have been cleaned up and would have made it a better album overall. And on the more political side of punk music, and yes, there's been politics infused in punk music since the very founding of the genre in the 70s. But it came out in 2021, and there's Nowhere Generation by Rise Against. I'd been a little bit more of a casual fan of their music before this album came out, and it was really this album that made me start digging deeper in their catalog. The album attempts to tackle a lot of the bigger issues in society today, and the album tries to be this rallying cry for basically a disenfranchised generation. And with all the other great albums that Rise Against has made over their career, this is one that I think I'd put closer towards the top of their catalog. One of the pillars of punk music since its founding is nonconformity. And I think when it comes to artists like that or fit that mold, there's probably no bigger album than Weird by Youngblood. Came out back in 2020. This is another one of those albums that really flew under the radar for me when it was released. Several people recommended it to me after this album came out, and I just hadn't gotten around listening to it. It was probably a few months after it came out that I finally sat down and streamed the album, and I was blown away by it. There's a lot of themes on this album of mental health struggles and gender issues, a lot of other stuff that, honestly in the 2020s, a lot of bands don't really touch in their music. Youngblood is somebody that really tried to go at it on this album, really take those issues head on, and try to be a voice for his generation. So in early 2021, I was scrolling through Apple Music and came across this album. And I had heard of the musician before. I'd never listened to any of his music. I knew he'd been the drummer at one point for Scary Kids Scaring Kids. But the album is Internet Killed the Rock Star by Mod Sun. And this album was kind of a bridge between this more nostalgic sound of punk music and emo rap that had been gaining in popularity over the last few years before this album came out. The album was produced by John Feldman from Goldfinger, and he injected his style of punk, or his brand of punk music, into what Mod Sun had wanted to do on this album. And the end result is an album that is one of my favorite albums in general from the 2020s. So last year I saw Green Day and Rancid in concert, and there was a young punk band that opened up for them that I had heard of them before. I'd never listened to any of their music. And then I think it was just shortly after I saw them in concert that their new album came out, and that is No Obligation by the Linda Lindas. And I was really impressed with such a young band. I think their drummer is like 14 or 15 years old. 3 of the 4 of them, I think, are still in high school. I was really surprised how good this album is, or how good their music is, with them being so young. When this album came out last year, it was met with widespread critical acclaim. And this album was a reminder that punk music can still be pure and fun, without losing its message, without losing its impact. And this band is very much a breath of fresh air in the punk scene in the 2020s. And with as young as they are, the sky's the limit for this band. Another album from last year that's one of my favorite albums of the last several years has it very much like, I think the best way to describe this album is it sounds like ripped right out of Warped Tour 99, and that is The Runs by Scooped Up. And while this album still has that nostalgic kind of sound to it, it's also updated. It has a more modern take to it, and the band is very fun to watch and follow on social media. They do a lot of really crazy stuff. I think they're one of those younger bands that's taking punk to a different area while still showing that it has its roots planted in the past. Something that's been one of the pillars of punk music basically since its founding is having that more DIY attitude in existence, and that's something that's fully embraced by Scooped Up. Something I was not expecting to be as good as it is when it was released. This came out in 2023, and that's Tomorrow Never Dies by Rancid. I've been a huge Rancid fan for a very long time, 30 plus years for the band. But I feel like their last couple of albums have been kind of disappointing to me. And then when this album came out, I didn't really know what to expect of it. I didn't pre-order the album. I actually didn't even listen to any of the singles until I was on my way to the record store that morning when this album came out. Streamed the album on the way there, instantly fell in love with this album. I bought a copy of it that day, and I think this is one of the band's best albums of the last 25 years, which is something that's pretty rare for a band this far into their career. So that brings me down to my final 3 albums, and I think these are the 3 albums that are in order. I think these are my top 3, and then everything else is kind of all bunched together. But I think these 3 have kind of cut themselves or separated themselves from the pack. And number 3, the album came out in 2020, and that was Death in Venice Beach by the Bomb Pops. Unfortunately, the Bomb Pops are no longer together. At least this version of the band no longer exists. But when this album came out in 2020, I was supposed to go to one of the record release parties, and then the pandemic hit, and I think it was that week, everything got shut down and canceled. And it was something I was pretty disappointed by because I was really looking forward to that record release. But by the time the band started touring again, Polly Van Damme had left the band, and that's kind of it for this version of the Bomb Pops. The record that I've got at number 2 is one of my favorite albums of last year. It's probably one of my most played albums since this album came out. That's Blood, Hair, and Eyeballs by Alkaline Trio. I've been an Alkaline Trio fan for almost 20 years now. I think this is one of the band's best albums. I think a lot of Alkaline Trio fans out there probably won't agree with me on that, but I think the sound of this album is different than what they were doing before. I think it had a lot to do with Matt Skiba being part of Blink-182 and the way that Blink recorded the 2 albums he was on. And after Matt Skiba rejoined Alkaline Trio, after Tom DeLonge went back to Blink-182, he brought that recording style to the band, and having them all together in the recording studio together, creating those songs as one unit, I think is what helped make this album so great. And then the album I got at number 1. And not only do I think this is the best punk album of the 2020s, I think this is one of the best punk albums of the 21st century. It came out in 2020, and that's Dancing with the Curse by Get Dead. With this album, Get Dead infused that more gritty sound back into punk music that I think had been kind of polished away over the last 10 or 15 years. Yes, it was always there in the underground, but I think as punk music got more popular in the early 2000s, and it became more of a commodity for labels, big labels, small labels, it got more of this polished sound to it. And Get Dead kind of threw all that to the side with Dancing with the Curse and brought punk music just back to its roots. And the album reflects that chaos and disillusionment that was going on in the early 2020s. It's political, it's aggressive, it's got elements of folk punk in here also. I think it's very different than a lot of other punk albums of the last, I'd say 5 or 10 years. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best punk albums of the 2020s. Because yes, 50 years into the genre, punk music is still alive. And there's a bunch of great punk albums that are being released every single year. This list could have been a lot longer. I think when I started making my list, I think I had to, initially it was like 30 or 35 albums. I had to cut it down to the 15 or 16 that I had. But the genre is still very much alive in the 2020s. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.